Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for July 9th, 2021. It's Friday, so I'm taking questions, and there were a lot of questions about the strategic situation because it is quite complex and quite multiply connected, and so I'm going to take those questions today. I would urge people, if you want more on the situation involving the pullout of troops from Afghanistan, that tomorrow, Saturday, there will be, as part of the Manhattan Project meeting, a more in-depth discussion of what the war was about and what the options are to get out of it. And the first question from several people is, will Afghanistan be plunged into a civil war now that the U.S. is leaving? Is it a mistake to leave? What does it mean for the drug trafficking and terrorism? And are there any options? So those are a number of questions. Let's just start with the obvious one. Our policy was initially to take down the government that allowed a safe haven for terrorists who were allegedly involved in the 9/11 attacks on the United States. Why does that become a 20-year presence there? The obvious point is, as was made clear from the WikiLeaks dump in 2010 of the Afghan documents from the military, there was no military strategy for victory. The military didn't know what to do after knocking out the government that had provided the safe haven. The question of building democracy has been one that's been at the center of most U.S. interventions in recent years. At least the excuse is that it's an anti-democratic regime that we've overthrown and now we're going to bring democracy. But democracy is not just something that you can plant in the ground and then walk away from. The reality is that if you study the history of the United States, the establishment of our democratic republic depended on two things. One is a framework, namely a constitution, which put power in the hands of the people, which implies citizens who are educated and committed to fighting to save that republic. But at the same time, you need an economic development perspective. For people to actually exercise their free will and their rights, it helps if they have a sense that the work they're doing is adding to a better future, and that they're operating as free people committed to that better future for their children and grandchildren. That's in our Constitution for ourselves and our posterity. So the question then becomes, how do you do that in a country which doesn't have a recent democratic tradition? And you have to then look at what's the problem in that country. And if you look at Afghanistan, what you see is that it's been a battleground for a century and a half of competing empires, none of which intended to do anything to improve the conditions for the people who lived there. It was largely combated over because of its geographical position. The British intended to use it as a buffer zone to protect the Indian subcontinent. So when you ask, will Afghanistan be plunged into a civil war? It's been in a civil war for the last years. The ability to defeat the Taliban won't take place unless the population has a clear picture that a democratic future will give them a livelihood, a possibility of living a life that's a human life. So why do they resort to drug sales, opium sales? Why do terrorists find a foothold there? Well, because the situation is unstable, weak, and poor. Now, you can't change that by pouring in money, but you can change it by having massive investments in infrastructure. What's lacking in the poorer countries in the world is cheap and abundant electricity and reliable electricity, water projects to make sure there's clean water, an agricultural system that provides adequate food, and a healthcare system that protects the population. Now, how do you get that? Well, in the case of a country like Afghanistan, look at its neighbors. You have China, you have Russia, not an immediate neighbor, but in the vicinity, Iran, India, Pakistan. These are countries which have a mixed development, some of them, in the case of Pakistan and Iran, but you have countries that are highly developed, such as China. Now, why not do what Mrs. LaRouche has proposed? Have the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, and the United States engage in economic reconstruction in Afghanistan. And we'll be discussing that tomorrow in the Manhattan Project meeting, so I won't go into it much more now. But without that kind of reconstruction program, you leave a situation of a destroyed society, lacking infrastructure, lacking the ability to ensure that people will have confidence that they'll be safe to pursue the development of their family and their neighborhood and their country. So lacking that, pouring in money is only going to make the people bringing the money in richer. We need physical development, and that's the key for Afghanistan. Now, a second question was from someone who asked about the constant attacks on China. Why is there no recognition of the progress, the great progress made by China in the last 20 years? And a similar question, and it's similar in what we're getting at, is why is there no recognition of the role of neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian security forces and in the coup in Ukraine? Well, the answer to both of those is the media. Why will the media not report on the tremendous development of China in eliminating poverty for 800 million people? That's an extraordinary accomplishment. To create a middle class from a poor peasant society which had been a victim of colonial looting for a century before the beginnings of a modern economy under Deng Xiaoping in 1978. Well, here's the answer to that. The only coverage of China's economy that you get is how it's now a threat to the United States, how the economic growth of China makes it a rival and a threat. Why does one nation's economic development have to threaten another nation? The reality is that the United States was perfectly willing, or U.S. corporations, I should say, were perfectly willing to use China as a source of cheap labor under the initial agreements of the World Trade Organization. But as the Chinese economy grew and developed and became more complex, and as the need to pay better wages and improve the living standards forced the Chinese government to move away from just being a resource of cheap labor, the corporations were not so happy. And all of a sudden, China came from being a compliant partner into being a threat, an enemy. That's the geopolitical strategy that doesn't allow any challenge to the unilateral power of the Anglo-American financial networks. Similarly, why not report on neo-Nazis in Ukraine? Well, the Ukrainian coup was a combined product of neoconservatives and neoliberals. Working side by side was Victoria Nuland, who's a hardcore neocon, who was there representing the State Department, George Soros, an ultra-liberal speculator. I mean, Soros is an example of what happens when you combine neoconservatism and neoliberalism. And also involved in the mix was Joe Biden, who was the Obama representative in Ukraine at the time of the coup. They used neo-Nazi militia, the Azov Battalion, the Pravy Sector, the Right Sector, as the shock troops in Maidan Square, carrying out assassinations, snipers shooting both government forces and so-called democratic protesters. This was a classic example of a regime change coup. And the intent was not to improve the situation for Ukraine, because we see under the government that replaced Yanukovych, the economic conditions in Ukraine have worsened. The corruption has worsened. The standards of living have fallen. The industrial production has collapsed. Ukraine was hoping that it could get the benefit of being connected with the European Union, but the European Union wasn't interested in the Ukrainian standard of living. It was a geopolitical ploy to put NATO troops on the border of Russia. So for the same reason that you won't get an honest assessment of Chinese economic development, only attacks and slanders, that's the same reason on Ukraine you don't get a true picture of what happened in the February 2014 coup and who's running the country now. And whatever President Zelensky thinks he's doing, he knows very well that at the back of his head is a gun held by the right wing that will not allow him to move ahead with the Minsk process for achieving a settlement for the eastern regions and Donbass. So again, it's the media, but the media serving the purpose of their cartel masters, of the financial and other cartels that are controlling Western governments. Now, the last question, again, goes back to Ukraine, and it's, what are your thoughts about Putin saying that if the Russians had sunk the HMS Defender, this would not lead to a war? Well, I spoke about this earlier in the week. I think there are two aspects to this. One is that Putin is saying that knowing full well that the idea that the NATO countries would risk a thermonuclear confrontation with Russia over defending Ukraine is highly unlikely, both because the damage to the West would be incalculable and the possibility of the annihilation of the human race is real. And so you'd have to be completely crazy to use a challenge to whether these waters are Russian territorial waters or whether they still belong to Ukraine. To use that challenge to go into a nuclear war would be absolute lunacy. Now, Lyndon LaRouche has pointed out that you cannot leave out lunacy as a factor when you're dealing with the oligarchy. So there is a possibility that Putin would be wrong in this, but he's probably right that the Western leaders would not risk a thermonuclear confrontation over Ukraine. And in fact, the rhetoric has backed off. Ukraine is not being brought into the NATO as a member nation, and so on. However, the Russians are being very clear that they will not tolerate these kinds of probes and these kinds of operations. So the prospect continues to exist that there could be a war triggered by this kind of British flight forward policy, which was announced by Dominic Raab, the foreign minister, 2 days ago, when he said that the Queen Elizabeth II carrier group is now gone through the Suez on the way to the Indochina region, to the South China Sea, that the British intend to continue keeping pressure on Ukraine, at the same time joining the forces in the South China Sea to confront China. That's the lunacy. There's no reason there could not be dialogue and discussion. And the final point here, where's the honesty among journalists? Why have so many journalists accepted the lies that go back to Russiagate, the lies about cyber warfare, the lies about use of Novichok poisoning against the so-called enemies of Putin, the lies about the Uyghur concentration camps? These have been investigated by many people in other countries, including Schiller Institute representatives, and found that they are nothing but lies constructed by the war hawks for the purposes of continuing their geopolitical confrontations. Why are these not reported? Well, this is the fight we have, that the cartels of finance, of real estate, of pharmaceuticals, the big corporate cartels are controlling governments, and they control the purse strings, including what is known as the military-industrial complex. They don't want anything to get in the way of their strategies and their games. The only thing that can stop it is a concerted effort of the people to elect officials who are not controlled by this criminal cabal. And all the complaining in the world about the criminal cabal, all the connecting of the dots to show who the bad guys are, means nothing unless you're using that to educate the population as to who our real enemies are. And by the way, that's why the China question is so important and the Russia question. The idea of the British psychological warfare experts is if you keep the American people focused on Russia and China, they'll miss the fact that they're being robbed and put into these wars and dangerous security situations by the British Empire that's manufacturing the narrative against Russia and China. So join with us to get the true story out there so that the American people can function in a clear and intelligent way in using the instruments of our republic to defend freedom and to defend economic development. And that means dialogue with our so-called enemies and adversaries, and better than just dialogue, actual cooperation to carry out the process of mutual development and mutually beneficial relations. So thank you for joining me today. Again, you can go tomorrow to the Schiller Institute website to see the dialogue on Afghanistan, where we'll go into much more depth on what the war was about and what the solution is. And hopefully I'll see you then.